Coming up next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Welcome to the City Club. I'm Pete Heuser, your president. Today we have with us Dr. Lenore Walker, who is executive director and founder of the Domestic Violence Institute in Colorado. Today's program is co-sponsored by the Women's Studies Department at Portland State University and the Women's Alliance for Global Equality. We appreciate their help in putting together this program. We have a new member who I think is in the audience today, Anna Peerbolt of Peerbolt Services. Anna, would you stand, please? Let's give a welcome, Anna. We look forward to seeing you active in our studies. Next week, we'll have Dr. Stephanie Kuntz, who's a professor at Evergreen State College. She's going to talk about the myth of the perfect family. She's an author of a recent book entitled The Way We Never Were. That'll be here at the Multnomah Club. Now remember to sign up for that luncheon by Wednesday at 2 p.m. instead of Thursday. We continue to need your cooperation at remembering that new earlier deadline. Our corporate sponsors today that are helping us make this program possible are U.S. Bank, Legacy Health Systems, and the law firm of Miller, Nash, Weiner, Hager, and Carlson. We're grateful for their support as well. The board host today, or hostess, is Susan Deskamp, an aide to Commissioner Charlie Hales. She'll, of course, ask the first question, and then we'll open up questions to City Club members in the audience. Also, people who are affiliated with the Women's Studies Department at Portland State and at the Women's Alliance for Global Equality can also ask questions. A year ago, the City Club published the results of its long-term study on domestic violence. You'll recall that that report concluded with a number of recommendations, all of which were adopted by the club membership. One of the recommendations was that legislation be passed to increase the classification of domestic abuse in repeat cases to a felony from a misdemeanor. The Oregon legislature recently enacted that law, and it went into effect on July 1st. The City Club report also recommended that we all do what we can to increase the public awareness of that issue, and that's part of what this program is today, to get it out in the public light. Dr. Walker has been involved in studying, writing, and speaking on this issue for almost 30 years. She received her PhD in psychology from Rutgers University in 1972. Her first book, which is considered a classic in the field, is entitled The Battered Woman, was published in 1979. And since that time, she's written 11 other books dealing with the subject. I asked her if she meant to write one other book. She said, no, it's 11 other books on the topic. So she's been very busy since 1979. During the O.J. trial, when Johnny Cochran announced that she would be testifying as an expert witness for the defense, he referred to her as the mother of the battered woman syndrome. Now, it was eventually decided that she was not going to take the stand on O.J.'s behalf, but you might recall that there was considerable press on whether she would be testifying. The O.J. trial really was the first time I had heard of Dr. Walker, and perhaps many of you had heard of her for the first time then, but she really has been the authority on the topic of domestic abuse for most of her career. We're certainly fortunate to have her with us today. Let's welcome Dr. Lenore Walker.
Thank you. I am really delighted to be here and to have the opportunity to share some of where I think the field of domestic violence, and we are a discipline, a field today, is going. In the new millennium, as someone said earlier today at another conference that's also being sponsored on domestic violence. My ties to Oregon are long and pleasant, I must tell you. I have began testifying here in Portland in 1979. So you need to congratulate yourselves on being in a city that was progressive enough in 1979 to admit testimony on behalf of a battered woman who killed her abusive partner in what she claimed was self-defense. So you were in the early group, and as a Denverite who has lived there for the past 23 years and a member of the International Women's Forum, I know a number of people in the audience who are also Oregon Women's Forum members. So we have a lot of good ties in the community. I'm still working on some cases. I have one in Corvallis and one in a suburb. What county? Washington County. I keep forgetting the suburban counties. So I'll be here again and again as long as Oregonians are supportive of the issues that we have to educate ourselves about. I think it's interesting that the talk that's following next week is going to be on the myth of the perfect family. I can tell you that one of the myths of the perfect family is that just because you look good when you open up those doors, when those doors closed, behind those closed doors of many of those perfect-looking families, existed criminal behavior that we define today criminal behavior, but abusive behavior that was so horrendous that it's taken an impact on the psychological toll of men and women in those families and passes down from generation to generation. I don't have to tell you all of that because I did have the opportunity to review the booklet that the City Club published last year, and you should be congratulated. You have really done what we are encouraging every community to do, and that is to take a look at the problem of domestic violence in your community and to make recommendations that make sense for where you live, for what you need to do so that you can protect and prevent domestic violence in the future. We have a lot of problems. You know, I often say when I speak to a civic group that you have to look at the issues of domestic violence with both eyes. One eye that looks backwards and says, we have really come a long way. And the other eye that looks forward and says, we've got a long way yet to go. And that's kind of where I see us. We have come a long way. We understand that domestic violence is an equal opportunity, if you will, disorder. It's a disorder of power and control. It's learned behavior. It can be unlearned, and it can be prevented. And that every institution and every community group in society is necessary to work on the prevention and on the healing of those people who have been exposed. That it's not a we, they, but it's an us kind of problem, and that many people in this room have been exposed to domestic violence in some part of their family or friendships. Even when I used to speak to groups and I would ask people to raise their hands if they ever knew anybody who was abused, and a few hands would go up. I won't do it in this room today, but today when I ask that question to many groups, almost every hand is raised. It's not that people weren't exposed to it, it's that we didn't define what we were seeing and what we knew as domestic violence. And indeed, it's public education and the translation of the research data and the advocates' work, what we learn from advocates together, that's really made the difference. And that's what's going to push us into the new millennium and is going to help us deal with a problem that's so pervasive it doesn't escape any of our institutions or any of our lives. Even for those people who have moved to the suburbs or the rural areas, such as in Springfield, Oregon. There we have one teenage boy who was extremely disturbed, whose parents tried everything they knew, that they, according at least to the reports, that they were able to find, and yet this boy committed mayhem in a town that's going to take a long time to heal from it. And that's happening in community after community. No longer is violence an issue that's only in the urban streets amongst minorities. Today, violence affects all of us. We have new rules about violence in the workplace, and some of the new regulations look at the overlap between domestic violence at home and violence in the workplace. We know that children who are exposed to violence in the home, little boys, if he watches his father batter his mother, he is 700 times more likely to use abuse in his own life. 700 times at risk. I mean, think about the magnitude of that number. If, on the other hand, he also is abused, and about 60% of the children who grow up in these homes are abused themselves, it raises that risk to 1,000 times the norm. So as responsible citizens, we have to get in there and do some prevention. And we have to look at the problem, I think, as your booklet suggests you have, as a public health problem. Although we must have the cooperation of the criminal justice system, we are failing in the civil courts. We're failing in family courts. Because what do? We suggest that violence will stop if the woman leaves the battering relationship. But what's the truth? What do we know from our experience of 25 years of this work? Is that violence doesn't stop when the woman leaves the relationship or the relationship terminates. In fact, violence increases. The risk of someone being killed or more seriously hurt occurs from the point of separation to 2 years post-separation. Now, what do we do to families during that time? Well, studies have shown that those custody battles, the most difficult and bitter custody battles being fought, a large percentage are battles in families where there has been abuse of power and control, which again is domestic violence. Even if it isn't physical abuse and it's psychological abuse, it is still debilitating for every member of that family. And we know that there are threats, and there's stalking, and there's use of and abuse of the legal system to continue the power and control around access to visitation and custody of children. And we end up in a zeitgeist where psychology, and my own colleagues in psychology, have recommended that the healthiest approach for children is to have equal access between mothers and fathers. Now, that is true for homes where you don't have domestic violence. In domestic violence homes, it is increasingly difficult to have that kind of equal access without having children have to run the gamut of two totally different people and have a mother who is frightened of the father, which makes her less able to parent and protect the children. Women say that they go back to domestic violence relationships, one, because they're terrified that they're more likely to be killed when they're out than when they're in, which statistics tell us is true, and two, because they lose control over being able to protect their children, which is also true. Many of these fathers don't demand the time with their children when they're together with the woman. They demand it after the separation and divorce. So we need to go and clean up our divorce courts. And of course, I think, although there are some problems with it, one of the possibilities is a recommendation that City Club made in your booklet, which was to have the presumption of custody go to the mother, although it's a rebuttable presumption, which in the law means that the man can certainly introduce evidence to prove that he is a good father, even if it was found that he did commit domestic violence. And that is a fair way of giving him the opportunity to say, wait a second, I've taken this learned behavior in hand, and I've made some choices, which is to unlearn that behavior and use other kinds of methods to deal with my family members. And we hope that that will be true in every family where we discover domestic violence. But it also protects children where we don't have such evidence. So we know that we have to make some more changes within the legal system itself. I also advocate strengthening our public health system so that we begin to deal with domestic violence in a bit of a different way. For example, when we use the criminal justice system to define what is domestic violence, we're defining it from what is criminal behavior. But not all domestic violence acts are criminal behavior. The real glue, the underbelly that keeps these relationships together is the psychological coercion and duress that's used in addition to and punctuated by physical and sexual abuse in the relationship. But psychological abuse, unless it's done in a method that's called stalking or harassment, very difficult to prove in the criminal justice system, doesn't really get the proper attention that it needs. The public health system takes a standard that's already been developed in the domestic violence field, and that standard is we look at the relationship from the victim's perspective. We want to know how she perceives it, because the number one standard is everything we do has to look at victim safety first. We always have to look at that before we make any intervention whatsoever. Well, the public health system looks at things from the health and security and mental health of the victim, of the person who the public health system is dealing with. And when I've been a consultant for the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, which is part of the World Health Organization, and in Latin America, and I've been to a number of the Central American countries. Very exciting work that's going on there. Well, of course, they're changing the laws, and as we have done, and they are looking at both the criminal justice system, they are strengthening their public health system. And a lot of the work they're doing, the public health system is the central part because they have the ability, they already have a very strong public health system in many of the Latin American countries. And it will teach us, we can learn from, of course, our brothers and sisters and, across the borders. And I think it's some very exciting work that will carry us forward in the next few years as we begin to turn some of our attention to public health. Now, why do I focus on public health? Well, when I was trained, sometimes it seems like many years ago, of course we were barely even looking at child abuse. I don't know how many of you are aware of the fact that the first child abuse protection laws in this country didn't get passed until the very early 1970s, late 60s in a couple of places, but most of them in the early 1970s. I mean, think about that. We kind of go about thinking that they've been in place for a very long time, but they really have not. And during that period of time, we were also looking at community mental health. The goal at that time was to take the mental health system and bring it to the community, back down as far as we could to the community, and only remove people from the community, like to not warehouse them in state hospitals for any length of time, but just enough to help get them back on their feet and then maintain people in the community. Well, it was a colossal failure in many places because it created a whole set of homelessness problems, and I know that you have some of them here under the bridge in Portland, because I've worked on a couple of cases, especially with some youth that have been involved in that area. And we've got them in all the cities all over the country. Part of that problem, I think, is because we stopped funding community mental health. But some of the theoretical premises were very important. And I just want to share it with you a little bit of that here today. What we believed was in community mental health and in public health is that you have to work on three areas at the same time when you try to deal with a problem that has health problem implications but also societal implications, the context within which the problem occurs. And those three areas are the primary prevention, on secondary intervention levels, and on tertiary or third level intervention, which is your hospital, or you're taking people out of the community for a little bit of time, or in the battered woman's field, the battered woman's shelter. Most people won't need it, but some will, and we must have it in the community so we have a place that really stands up loud and clear and says, if you are harmed in that way, we have something in the community that will help heal you. But the real work, also the largest amount of work, has to be done at the primary and the secondary intervention levels. Primary prevention levels is to really say, wait a second, this is a problem that could affect any one of us, and we must prevent it from happening in the first place. And the secondary level is to help heal those people who have already been exposed and who have some indications of effect from the problem. In mental health, we call that the outpatient therapy level, where we provide treatment, and we provide short-term and long-term treatment depending upon how much money you have, what HMO you belong to, and what access you have to that kind of treatment, frankly. Politics always figures into the delivery of our system. But when you think about it that way, prevention is general public prevention and prevention for those people who are at high risk, who have been exposed and are high risk. And if you think about it in terms of malaria, let's use that as an example. In malaria, when we dealt with the problem of malaria, particularly in other countries, we tried to look at tertiary level. If somebody was sick, had been exposed to the malaria germ, we had the tertiary level care for those people. I told you analogous to that in the battered women's movement, it's been the battered woman shelter. For batterers, who really could not be stopped from violence in any other way. We didn't set up new hospices for batterers, although in Israel there is a hospice that's been set up, or a shelter for batterers who have no place else to go. I wasn't exactly too excited about it because I felt if you have a finite amount of resources, we have a perfectly good shelter for them. It's called jail. And that's where we want to put men who commit a crime. Why are we setting up another place for them? However, I was overruled as a guest of the country. They decided to try this as an experiment. And I have to tell you, they have some good points. And the good points are that when you're not in a punishment-oriented situation, you have a better chance of gaining some cooperation about treatment. And so they're setting up some very interesting treatment models within this particular batterers treatment program that includes a residential component to it. So it's not an all bad idea at all. Although if you only have a finite amount of money you have to make, and that's a social decision. That's a decision that you as community and civic leaders have to help the community make those kinds of judgments, because it's not an infinite amount of resources that we have. So, okay, so we have, on the tertiary level, we have a comparison. On the secondary intervention level, we have treatment programs that are what we call trauma-specific programs. Now, some of them are very effective for battered women, especially when they get to the programs, although we've had a lot of battles and fighting about it because we have had insurance companies that didn't want to pay for a therapy if a woman was a battered woman. And so we've had to really fight a lot of those battles on a community level, and we've needed community leaders and politicians and policymakers to really get involved to make sure that that did not happen, that it didn't become a liability to have post-traumatic stress disorder or battered woman syndrome as we label those symptoms. At the same time, we have designed treatment programs for batterers, but they are treatment programs that go on in the criminal justice system. I suggest they don't touch the batterers who are also mentally ill. And we do have batterers that have some very serious mental health problems that would be helped by mental health providers. And we haven't done that yet, and that's a gap in services that we really have to look for. I spend a lot of my time trying to train psychologists, my colleagues, to be able to deliver some of those services. And I have to tell you, I have much more success in training people who want to work with battered women and help them heal than people who want to work with batterers. They simply don't want to work with many of these men. And those who do sometimes get seduced by the dual personality that we see. We often see what the women describe as a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. He can be very pleasant, very charming at some points, and he can be mean and violent at other times. And most of us today as community citizens are beginning to see those kinds of differences, but not everybody. And then in the primary prevention level are the things that we're doing today that you have been doing in really getting out the message to the entire community that this community will not tolerate violence, a zero tolerance for any kind of violence in the home. There are many ways to work out disagreements. Violence is simply not going to be one that this community is going to tolerate. And when you put out that message loud and clear, you have many more people stopping the use of their violence because the consequences are the social relationships that they want to have in their community. But you miss a whole lot of people. There are some people who are not at all interested in social relationships in a community. They're disaffected, they're alienated, and for these people, again, we have to find other ways of reaching them. And so public education is not always going to reach everybody, and that's why you need a full program across the program. When we dealt with malaria, we found a drug that was very helpful, quinine. We used that both as a preventive and we used it for secondary intervention. But what was the one thing that we discovered? When we discovered that malaria was being spread by the mosquito, we knew we had to clean up the swamps. Well, in battering and in domestic violence, if we don't clean up the social system that breeds domestic violence and violence in our communities, no matter how good we are at prevention or at other kinds of intervention, it's going to come back again, just like the malaria came back again because the mosquito was the carrier. And I suggest that sexism and racism and all the other kinds of non-tolerance of difference in our communities is one of the areas of the swamp that has to still be cleaned up. And to do that, we really need the cooperation of everybody. It's not just about mental health or about health, although we've got all the statistics that tell us how much people use the health and the mental health systems when they're available for them. And it's not just about the justice or the criminal justice system. It's about violence in the workplace. It's about violence in our communities, and we need to use the pulpits from our churches and our synagogues and the civic organizations that we belong to. We really have to do what you're doing, which is heightening the awareness of the violence in our community. We also need to spread the word about some of the newer things that we know. And so when you revise your pamphlet, I've got some things you can add to your booklet because there are some new things that we know. We know, for example, that batterers can be classified. There are 3 major classifications. I've alluded to them. The first is the power and control batterer. He's the one we know the most about because he passes through our justice system on the misdemeanor level, and we put him in treatment programs that are what we call offender-specific treatment programs designed specifically for men who are choosing not to control their tempers or who are continuing to use and abuse their power in their families. But we also have the mentally ill power and control batterer whose treatment I think there's about 40, that's about 40% of the population. I think about 40% are power and control batterers, about 40% are the mentally ill power and control, also power and control. So it's not that we eliminate it, we add it. And then the third group is about 20% of the batterers are those who are antisocial personality disorders and criminals. And they're often the ones we think about when we think about domestic violence. All of them have the risk of using substances, alcohol and drugs to excess. We know that if somebody is using alcohol to excess, the level of injuries and harm to the women and children is greater. The risk goes up that these women and children will be more seriously harmed. Now there's another type of batterer that has just been isolated by some researchers up at the University of Washington. They call them cobras and they call them pit bulls. And the pit bull is very similar to the batterer who I've been talking about, the one who keeps raging, he escalates, he's dependent on women, and he also sometimes thinks he's a victim himself. And when he presents himself, that's how he presents. But the cobra is an interesting type of batterer who's very difficult to recognize because he looks like the rest of us. When he gets angry, instead of escalating, he has a lowered heart rate, and he starts to get more deliberate. And he plans, and he waits, and he lies in wait like the cobra, ready to spring on his victim when the time is right. And he believes that the time will always be right. He'll find the right time, and he will get revenge and vengeance when he can. And he often is very diabolical. And in this research in the University of Washington, what they're finding is that he's the most difficult batterer to leave. Most batterers won't let the woman go. This man terrorizes the woman, so she's so paralyzed she doesn't even attempt to make the move. So now that we know that there are these different types, we have the opportunity to design programs, intervention programs that are necessary for each type. You can imagine that a program that's good for power and control batterers who escalate their anger and teach them how to control their anger isn't going to be useful for the cobra. He already knows how to control his anger. We need to have him divert his anger into more socially appropriate ways. And that's a very different kind of skill that we have to teach him. We also know a lot, more than we ever knew, about the biochemistry of being exposed to trauma. And I just want to take a minute or two to tell you a little bit about what we know, because I think this is going to be the biggest breakthrough in information that we've got. We call it, the field is being called psychoneuroimmunology. It's at least a part of it. And what we're now finding is that those people who are exposed to trauma have major neurotransmitter changes in the midbrain area of the brain. Now, those structures in that part of the brain are not part of language, and they're not part of how we translate things into what we think about verbally. They're the area of the brain that mediates emotions and our emotions. And what happens, and I won't give you all of the long names of all of the biochemicals, which even I haven't memorized yet, but what I can tell you is that the changes in the brain are responsible for some of the changes in memory, some of the fight or flight responses that many of the victims talk about. When you have to have all of the arousal of the mind and the body to fight danger. And it's the same danger response that you have to anything that is traumatic or anything that is dangerous to any organism. But it changes the arousal and the ability to regulate emotions over a period of time. Now imagine what that does to a child whose brain is developing. It may well change structure as well as the function of the brain. And we don't know that yet. But we do know that there are ways to be able to calm down some of those neurotransmitters and to equalize them. Some of that's in the newer serotonin reuptake drugs that we are now using in the mental health field. So the combination of being able to get the professional mental health people, the professional health people, because the immunological system is also compromised in the body, working together with the legal system, with the advocates, with the civic club, with our policymakers who have to make policies that are consistent with the research is a real challenge for all of us. I want to end my formal remarks before we take questions. I want to talk a little bit about the O.J. Simpson case because I promised that I would. I got a couple of calls and faxes from some people who are members of your club who were a little concerned about what my role exactly was in the O.J. case, and I thought I'd spend a little bit of time sharing with you. what it was. I got called by Johnny Cochran, who I knew for many, many years. He was one of the first district attorneys in the nation, along with our district attorney, Norm Early, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, who began to design proper programs for prosecutors, change the way prosecutors would deal with these cases. And he was, of course, doing it in Los Angeles when he was in the state attorney's office, the city attorney's office, rather. And so I had known him, and we had minor contact over the years and contact through other people. And he called me and said, we're getting a lot of reports in the O.J. Simpson case. This was like maybe 2 months after it happened during the summer. I don't understand all of them. I really need somebody with your expertise to help me be my consultant in understanding what's happening and seeing if these are legitimate reports or not. Now, would that be a bad thing to do? I didn't think so. I thought it was actually, I was kind of interested in doing it. I was an O.J. Simpson fan from my childhood. You know, he was the first African-American athlete. I really admired his skill and his ability to, he was the first athlete who really was able to make a corporate success of himself. And so it was a very interesting area for me, and one in which I felt I could apply my expertise. But I told Johnny I would only take the case under 3 conditions. The first one was that no one in the defense team could make any more disparaging remarks about Nicole Simpson. Now, she was not what we would call a good battered woman. For those of you who have followed the case, you know she was, she had went out at night. She did a lot of things that we didn't necessarily think that, was inconsistent with the image of the poor, bedraggled, battered woman. But she was still a battered woman if she was being battered. And if indeed the defense was going to be he didn't do it, it didn't matter what her behavior was. I mean, she could be anything she wanted to. She doesn't deserve to get killed for it. So that was real clear to me. And it was clear to Johnny. I said, you can't, I knew he couldn't control what the media did and what other people said, but he could control the defense team. And if he didn't, I told him what the consequences would be, just to help him understand how serious I was. I would not only walk off the case, I'd walk right to the nearest television camera and let them know what was happening. So he agreed with that. The second one was that he had to show me everything I asked for, or he had to explain to me why I couldn't see it. And he had to make all witnesses available to me if I wanted to interview them. And he agreed to do that as well. And the third was that it had to be kept confidential unless he and I changed our agreement that I was a confidential consultant to the defense team. And I felt that was an appropriate use of my skills. And I frankly was naive. I had no idea, first of all, that it was going to get out and not be confidential. And second of all, that I would get such enormous amount of criticism from a small group of advocates who didn't understand what my role was in the case, who really believed that somehow one, was going to make a judgment whether he was guilty or innocent. I didn't. I have no judgment about that. That wasn't my job. Or two, that in some way I was going to be persuaded to get him off when he shouldn't get off. Again, not a job of an expert witness in a legal case. Although later I came to understand that using my status and my respect in the battered women's community, I probably should have been a little more careful about that. So you learn lessons when you get into some jams sometimes, and this was a good lesson for me to learn. In any event, it wasn't until science and advocacy clashed that my role changed. And that was when the prosecution persuaded the judge to allow the testimony of domestic violence to be used as a motivator and a rationale for the fact that he was a killer. And that really was, if you follow me, if a batterer batters somebody, then he can be considered that he was a killer. And we know that you cannot predict that if a man batters a woman, he's going to kill her. We simply don't have the data. Number one, fortunately, very few women are killed by batterers in relation to the number of women who are battered. The United States statistics are about 2,000 women are abused every year. 2.5 million women are abused every year, and about 2,000 women are killed. So if you do the mathematics on that, you can see you can't predict who is going to be killed. That's why we teach every battered woman, it could be you. You could be killed, and we have to continue doing that, because even though we can put them in high-risk categories, we can't really figure out who will be the woman to be killed. And so once the judge said that O.J. Simpson was the killer because he battered her, I felt a commitment to straighten out what the science was. So when they asked me, could they use me to testify to that, I said, yes, I'll testify to the research data. Well, I would have testified for either side what the research data were. And neither side called me because, frankly, I had good things and bad things to say about each side. And I realized that, and I was lucky that I didn't end up getting called, because I think no matter what I had to say, by the time the media circus was on in that case, it didn't matter. It wouldn't have mattered. And so I was very grateful that I didn't get called. Now, I did get called in the civil case, but I kept that pretty quiet too. And that was, by that time, there was no benefit for me to have anything more to do with the O.J. Simpson case. This was not something my career was going to benefit from. Although I really did feel a commitment to doing the work as a professional. But personally, my interest had already waned. But they called me in the civil case, and they wanted to take my deposition, Daniel Petrocelli. Well, you can read what he has to say about my work in his book. I was just being professional about it. They called me, and O.J.'s lawyers never bothered to look at my data. They never looked at my file. They never looked at my materials. When they called me and put my name on that witness list, they never asked me what would I say. So I said what I had to say, which was O.J. Simpson was a batterer as far as I was concerned. But I could not make a determination, nor should anybody make a determination, that he was a killer based on battering. That you could not do that, that you needed other evidence to make those kinds of determinations. So, of course, neither side wanted to call me to testify, which was exactly what I wanted, although they threatened in both cases right up to the last minute that they were going to call me. And very interesting, I was actually in Israel and Paris doing some training when Petrocelli announced to the court that I was going to be called on their side. And I realized they couldn't possibly call me, but there was Time magazine with a big article that I was going to be called. I was overseas. There was no way that they could have gotten me back into the country. They had no clue as to where I was. So don't believe everything that you read in the media. It just isn't always true. And I think they posture a lot in court, and there's just nothing that you can do about it other than to keep the truth clear in your own head. And so I share that with you. You're welcome, I know, in the question period to ask me any questions you want about the case. It was a very interesting and exciting period because I learned a tremendous amount in doing the case. And I learned that I couldn't always control the media, which I think up until then I thought, you know, I was sort of on the right side of justice. And in this case, I sure wasn't. And it wasn't as much fun as it was on the other side. When they were hiding down in my basement, you know, trying to get pictures of me with television cameras, I don't know what they thought my personal life was like. It's really quite boring compared to my professional life. I realized that I had no control whatsoever. Let me end by saying to you that there are exciting things that communities can do, and I want to challenge you to be as creative as possible for yourselves. You're off to a wonderful start, and I want to end with telling you a story of the Pink Ladies in Japan. It's one of my favorite stories because it really underscores the need to understand the context and culture of where you are in the kinds of interventions that you try to set up. When a long time ago I I had learned that there was a group called the Pink Ladies in Japan that were much like in Tokyo, they were much like their local battered women task force. I thought they were called Pink Ladies because they wore pink kimonos, which was true. But I was in Tokyo 2 years ago, and I learned that these Pink Ladies not only wore pink kimonos, but they also drove through the streets of Tokyo with pink motorcycles. So here they are, you know, zooming along. Now, what did they do? Well, in the Japanese culture, as you're probably aware, at least in the old culture, it is changing today, but in the old culture, many families, the man worked for one company for most of his lifetime, and the company really provided a lot of the family benefits for that particular family. And so some of these women went to the Pink Ladies and said they were being battered. So the Pink Ladies got pictures of the men, put them on big placards and posters, and wrote their names out to shame them, which is very important, of course, in Japanese society, and wrote out what they were doing. And they rode through the streets of Tokyo, holding up these posters on their pink motorcycles, and they stopped in front of the man's place of business. Now, what do you think the employers did? Well, now, this is not only a shame on the man and the woman and the family, but this is now a shame on the place of employment. And so the employers immediately not fired them, as Ronald Reagan did with his SEC chief when he found out he was battered, leaving the family destitute. They gave the money, the salary of this man, to the woman. And until the Pink Ladies came back, she got the finances of the family. Now that, I think, is a clever, creative way of stopping abuse without harming the family. So we've got to be as creative and as innovative as those wonderful Pink Ladies were in Japan, and continue your very positive and good work, and make sure that our communities are indeed violence-free and happy places to raise our families. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. That was very, very interesting, and I learned a great deal, especially immunology. My question is interesting, ending with the Pink Ladies, because I'm very concerned about prevention and what we can do here, what we can do to intervene, to volunteer, to help women that are clearly candidates for abuse. What is working in other parts of the country? I don't know about the Japanese model, that's a stretch, but that we could focus on in the Portland area, mentoring, where women can be matched up so that we can support women and help give them the courage to get away from an abusive relationship.
Great question. There are several things that we know about the property of domestic violence relationships that help us design just that kind of an intervention. The first is that the more you keep the doors closed, the more you give the swamps chance to breathe. So one of the ways to clean those swamps is to open the doors of those homes where domestic violence occurs. And that means we have to help the women open up the doors, because most of the men won't. Now, that is in direct contrast. There's a dilemma here, because the American ideal is to keep our families closed and those doors to our families closed. So we really have to find a balance of getting people into those homes and exposing those homes so that people can look at what is happening. One of the ways to do that is to identify high-risk families and send in some helpers, people whose role is not the state and not to prosecute or to report, but to help, give assistance to young women and young families where there's a high risk of possible domestic violence, and to make sure our families are not as isolated. The second thing we know is that the more the woman is isolated, the more likely she is to continue in domestic violence. So we need to be just plain and simple friends. We need to offer the hand of friendship without judgment. Too often, families get really tired of helping the woman because she keeps going back, and many battered women do go back because, as I said, being out of the relationship doesn't stop the violence, and it makes it even more difficult for some women to deal with. So we need to be friends that truly don't have any requirements other than just being there and being a good ear, and help provide for her a more normal view of what life is really like. And if we can do those two things and design programs with those two things, we will really be saving a lot of battered women.
Corleen Kraft, City Club member. I'm very interested in the chemical and brain changes that these studies have recently, that you mentioned recently. What I'm wondering is threefold. Are the changes reversible? Has there been an observation whether or not they can be reversed if the woman is removed from the situation? And I'm wondering if the incidence is as high in women who've been psychologically abused as that in women who are physically. And I'm blanking on the third part.
Well, let's take these two, and then
Okay,
I'll
thank
let
you.
you come back, okay? The answer is very simple. We don't know yet. Some of the changes we know are changes in the way the hypothalamus works, the pituitary works, and the adrenaline glands work, and the amygdala, that whole inner brain, midbrain system, by elevating levels of adrenaline and noradrenaline and something called glucocorticoids and the production of endogenous opiates. Now, this is interesting because what it tells us is that for many women, when they are actually being abused in the middle of an acute battering incident, they are producing chemicals that are making the injuries less likely to feel the injuries. Their bodies, like in any time of danger, are reducing the inflammation and helping the body deal with the injury. So it's not always bad biochemical changes. I want to stress they can be very positive ones in that way. And that's why so many women don't go to the hospital unless they have absolutely no choice, or to the doctor, because they don't feel the injuries until afterwards, when the biochemicals recede. Now, there are also changes in the amount of dopamine that's produced and in the amount of lessening in the amount of serotonin. And some of that has to do with the flashbacks. What we do know is that some of the new medications that are being used, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, can re-regulate the system. And so for those people who need that, that can be very helpful. But we also know that this happens to people, anybody who's in an extreme trauma over a period of time, and body and mind can just readjust if we can only find safety. So although we don't have the actual research, there's every reason to believe that it will go back to the normal levels again.
Thank you. And that addressed the third question, which was, how does this manifest itself? Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Walker. I'm Dr. Joseph Eusterman, City Club member. A couple of questions. I'm curious about, I'm sure it's negligible compared to the women that are being abused, but I'm interested in what you know about males being abused in the domestic violence situations. And then also, I'd like to get your thoughts on the drug culture of the 60s, so to speak, and whether or not we're paying a price for that in terms of this type of violence. I do some examinations for SSI benefits for people, and it's been my observation that there are a lot of people in their 50s now who have suffered significant brain damage as a result of substance abuse in the 60s. And some of that is manifested in domestic violence situations. Could you address those?
Good questions. Let me take the drug culture first, because I think we're all, those of us who are working in the fields, the health fields, are all seeing some of the fallouts from the heavy drug use. I guess the 60s is probably as good as any, but it's still taking place. Some of that drug, and some of that is stuff I think we're just going to continue to see. I don't know whether it associates with battering or not, and domestic violence or not. There's not been any work that I'm aware of. What we do know, however, is that the single most likely predecessor for using drugs or alcohol to excess in women is, guess what? Abuse. So it may well be that women are trying to self-medicate themselves and self-medicate the trauma by using some of the drugs and alcohol. And as we know, alcohol is certainly a depressant, but at first it can be a stimulant, or it can be some way of calming people down initially before you have the drop in depression. So we don't really know a lot. We do know that the two most common drugs used by men who are abusive are you can probably guess, cocaine and its derivatives, crack and crank and all the other derivatives, and amphetamines and methamphetamines, because those are the drugs that are really the high stimulants. There are some other drugs that are also used, but not as much as those two that we find, at least that we're finding in some of the cases. Now, the SSI benefits is very interesting, because what we've been finding is that there's some neurological changes in battered women, particularly in the women, that are not being seen right away, much like punch-drunk boxers, that and shaken baby syndrome, that all the head banging and the throwing on the bed and the shaking by the shoulders are causing long-term neurological sequelae that don't show up right away. But if that person's like in a minor traffic accident, automobile accident, or some other minor trauma that you wouldn't expect to produce such debilitating symptoms, the combination seemed to make it a downward slide that we just haven't been able to deal with. And that may be part of what you're also talking about with that particular group. And so long-term benefits for many battered women, especially when you're doing dissolution cases and divorce cases, maybe we have to take some money and put it in reserve someplace in case this does show up later on in her life. Now, yes, there are men who are battered. That's your the second question. Somewhere around 5% of the population that we see are men who are being battered, and they are being battered by women. That's not mutual violence, which is another percentage, and we don't exactly know what that percentage is. But about 5% are indeed battered men. We know very little about them. They show up a lot in mental health treatment because they often have mental health symptoms that appear to be different than post-traumatic stress disorder, oftentimes mood disorders and affective disorders. But we don't know a whole lot about them.
Thank you.
Let's have two more short questions.
Okay.
Hi. Well, I'll just bend over. Take too long to figure this out. My name's Matthew Witt. I'm just an interested citizen visiting today. The question is, you noted this issue of violence in the community. However, it seemed sort of opaque to me. I wasn't sure exactly what you meant. I'm going to try a less elegant metaphor for you than yours on the swamp. Yeah, if there's headwaters to this issue, and if there's a waterfall at the end of which that falls disproportionately on women, what are those headwaters, this violence in the community that you see?
Well, I think that we have to take a look at gender issues. They're critical, and if I had more time, I'd give you some of the issues around developmental psychology that help us understand that when both boys and girls are exposed to trauma, boys tend to learn how to use aggression and model aggression in their own homes, and that's why I gave you those risk factors for being exposed to it. If you put them in combination with some of the easy access to guns, with the violence on television, with violence in communities, on the street violence, many teenagers, the violence in the schools that teenagers are afraid of, you potentiate that risk for using violence. And in the teenage years, it's pretty equal, boys and girls being both victims and aggressive. But it seems to kind of level out after the teenage years, where girls are much more, women are much more likely to be the abuse victim, and men are more likely to be the abusers.
Pauline Anderson, City Club member. As a precursor to domestic violence, dating violence seems to be increasing at an alarming rate. Is there any place in your travels you've seen where they are effectively working with dating violence?
Boy, if we could get a way to know who was going to be a better and be able to teach it to teenagers. I often thought I'd become very rich and be able to stay home at my beach house. I think the best way to do that is to ask his previous girlfriend. At any age, whether it's a teenage or whether it's any one of us who are single and want to continue to date men. Problem is we all think, women are trained to think that we're better than the last woman. And so we'd never do what she did, right? And so we have to, in our own way, be able to accept the fact that when he's angry and he uses violence with his anger, we could be his next victim. Now, how you teach that to young women is really something else, because we're clashing with adolescent development, which says they got to learn from their friends and not from adults. So I think one of the models for us to look at is adapting the drunk driving model, because that's been very successful in teaching teenagers. We have far more teenagers, not all of course, but far more, who are more respectful of not driving when you're drunk and having a designated driver and those other kinds of campaigns. So that's a good topic. I think if we're going to end now, I think it's a perfect topic to end on for the City Club, to take that as a challenge.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walker. We appreciate your coming. You can see that we're very